Hi, and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode 19, and today I'm going to be talking about the hand smoother. How does it operate? What does it differ from the paper magic drawers? How can we use the principles of the hand smoother in the deck design? And we are going to use 17 lens data, as always, to try to decipher how exactly does the smoother work and what are the ins and outs of it without knowing the algorithm. So this is all partially speculative, but it's based on big data sets, so the speculation is not exactly based on nothing. But as always, for an easy start, I will start with a preamble of my podcast. I thought that it may be better to start with it rather than finish with it, since they are mostly related to magic itself. And today I'm going to talk about paying attention to mana bases. And this is something I'm going to be talking right now and maybe put some hypothesis, but tomorrow I'm going to make a mini analysis on Twitter just to see if people that care about their mana quality also cares about their mana quantity and does it reflect in any way in their win rates. But basically, I think that it's way too often that we draft, we pay attention to cutting this 23rd playable card in your deck. We ask 17 people to give us input on what cuts should be done and what additions can be made and what maybe even the sideboard plans would be. And then we just submit the deck with the default arena mana base, which doesn't always do a great work. And I think that there is plenty of percentage points of win in constructing your mana base correctly. And you will see some streamers, I think that Coracles is a very good example of that. He will always build the deck and then he will spend, a minute or two looking at the mana, looking at the numbers of basics, looking at the fixing, looking at the casting cost, looking at the prevalence of the double casting cost in his deck, and then he will make minor adjustments or not, but he will always play around with it. So, and I think, and lots of people don't. And I find it slightly strange because this is really where you're going to lose your games, especially in best of one, because you will usually have good mana draws. You will not lose your games because you could have put a marginally better 23rd playable, but you will lose a lot of games because of the mana screw, color screw, maybe not mana screw, but color screw definitely. And we should definitely look at it in more detail and figure that. So here comes my hypothesis. People that care about what lands they play are going to have a slightly higher win rate because by changing the lands from defaults to the ones that they like, they actually have to think about their mana base for that second. So during making the analysis of the hand smoother, I looked at the list of cards that people use, and I discovered that I can actually make a list of basic lands that are the most popular ones in the format, which I'm going to put on Twitter tomorrow. But one thing I found is that a good 60-70% of the people just use a default mana base. Now, that makes me think that at least some of those people will just click through their mana base and accept it. I don't know what percentage of them is it, but definitely some percentage does exactly that. So what I'm going to check tomorrow is I'm going to try to look for differences in win rates between the players that do change their lands to custom ones, because by changing to custom ones, they had to remove all the lands, put them back, and then they have to reassess the numbers that they need to put based on their deck. So the hopeful hypothesis is that people who change their basics to custom ones will have a slightly elevated win rate than expected because they do that. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. So yeah, do pay attention to your mana bases. Be vigilant about them. Think about them. Look at it one last time just before you submit the deck, because that's where your hidden win percentages that you can gain might be. But back to the main topic, best of one. So best of one, when it first was played on Arena, is a completely different Magic than the one we know and love. Basically, only one game decides the outcome of it. And in regular conditions, it would mean that many of the games would be decided by variance. Basically, 20 to 25% of the games in best of three in the traditional paper versions will end in mulligan in limited. And that's mulligans are much more punishing when you only have one game to play rather than you have two games to come back from the first loss. So Watsy quite smartly decided to smooth the first hand to reduce non-games. And today I'm going to be looking at what does it mean that they smooth the first hand, and what does it mean in terms of gameplay and in terms of turn 6 potential, and how can it inform your deck building, and how you can use the knowledge of the smoothing algorithm to your advantage. So hand smoothing in general means there are several hands drawn before the game, and one of them is selected by the algorithm based on a set of rules. And those rules will promote particular types of land counts in your hand, which results in fewer mulligans because you will more rarely have low numbers of lands or very high numbers of lands in your hand. But how does it work exactly? Wizard was always vague about it, and there's some information. Some people that dig really deep into the release notes will know that most likely it's selected based on 3 hands, and we're going to be actually able to show that via the data that I collected, that it is indeed probably done on the 3 hands. So Zach is asking, how much is hand smoothing better or worse than giving players a free mulligan? I think that it's better in terms of the odds of having a more playable hand. And we're going to look at numbers. Maybe it will be easier to answer that question in full when we have the numbers. I'll keep that in mind. Okay, so first of all, let's start with the data description. I got presented, of course, by 17lands.com. Please follow, sponsor, use 17lands. It's a very useful tool, and it's a very noble goal indeed. But I've been provided by them with data from over 500,000 games. And out of those, I selected decks that are 40 cards only, which still makes it over 500,000 games. All the games are from Crimson Vow Premier Draft. All the games are 17lands.com users. And I only took into account the first hand drawn. And what does it mean? It means even if they mulliganed, I still can see their first hand that they mulliganed, and I took that hand and I analyzed that hand, just not to be, because if I didn't take the mulliganed hands, that would mean that I'm not looking at the perfect sample of what is actually being drawn. And if I took the second hands or excluded mulliganed games, I would have a huge bias in my data. So I managed to get the data set when I actually see the hand, whether it was mulliganed or no, as it is. So I get actual data on how does the first hand drawn look like in 17lands best of 1, independently of the mulligans. So to compare it with the paper versions, I used theoretical data that I calculated, and I used the hypergeometric calculator. You can find dozens of those on online. Pick your favorite one. Some of them are even customized for Magic the Gathering, because there's enough nerdage in our ranks to have a need for customized hypergeometric distribution tools for Magic the Gathering. But basically, it allows you to calculating an odds of drawing X copies of card A from a deck with Y cards that contains Z copies of card A. So basically, you'd have to input those data. I'm drawing 7 cards from a 40 card deck, and there is 10 copies of card A in them, and it will give you the chance of drawing 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. And based on that, I calculated those theoretical data to compare it with what we actually see in real data from best of 1, which should be different because smoothing changes the outcomes compared to what in theory would be, but theoretic data should be in line with what we see in paper. So first thing I looked at it was the average lands per hand, because this is the most easy way of measuring, does hand smoothing really change something dramatically? So these values, and I will put my trusty laser pointer for those that are watching, these values represent how many lands on average you will have in your opening hand in a deck with this amount of lands in your first 7 cards. So in 15 land card deck, you will on average have 2.6 lands in your opening hand. In a 17 land deck, you will have roughly 3 lands in your opening hand. And if it's 18, it's like 3.15. So obviously, the more lands you put in your deck, the more on average lands you will have in your opening hand. These are the theoretical values, which means that these are the values you will expect in paper Magic, and these are the values that you will expect in the best of 3. Now, here are the values after the hand smoothing, and they are exactly the same. So there is like 0.01 land differences between them, which could be easily attributed to the variance if there is even any difference. So like you see no difference. So this is the first thing that we learn about hand smoothing, is that the smoother, independently of how the algorithm works, doesn't change the average number of lands that you're drawing in your opening hand. If you have 17 lands, independently if it's best of 3 or best of 1, you will get the same average number of lands in your hand. But clearly something is changing. So if it doesn't change the average, it must change something else, because otherwise there wouldn't be any smoothing. So to look at that, I took a look at the distribution of lands drawn in the paper version of Magic using the hypergeometric calculator. And what you can see in that graph, or what you can hear me now describe in that graph, is that one important thing is that independently if you have 15, 16, 17, or 18 lands in your deck, approximately a third of your hands will have 3 lands, which is a funny property of how the deck mana bases are constructed. But basically it doesn't matter. 15 or 18, you will get roughly a third of your hands containing 3 lands. What changes, and changes quite dramatically, is the number of 2 lenders, 4 lenders, and 1 lenders, and 5 lenders in your hand. This is where the differences are. So for example, if 15 land deck will have 30% of hands with 2 lands and 17% hands with 4 lands, while a deck with 18 lands will have 22% of 2 lenders, so 8 percentage points less than the 15 land deck, and it will have 25%, so a quarter of the hands will have 4 lands, which is, again, roughly 8 percentage points more than the 15 land deck. And these things are quite linear in this particular area, so for the listeners. So basically, it drops by roughly 3 percentage points if you reduce a land in terms of 2-lender hands, and it increases by roughly 3 percentage points with every land that you add in terms of how many 4-land hands you have. What's more important is that you get quite a number of no-lenders. So it varies from roughly 3% in 15-land decks to 1% in 18-land decks. So even in an 18-land deck, you will get like 1 in 100 hands will contain 0 lands. And also between 14 and 7% of the hands will have 1 land only. And this is the reason why there are so many mulligans in best of 3. Because if you play 15 lands, which you probably should rarely do, you will get roughly 17% of your hands with 0 or 1 lands. And if you play 17 lands, as you probably most likely will, it's still around 10% of the games when you start with 0 or 1 lands. Furthermore, there is a roughly equal number of hands that have 5 or 6 lands. 7-landers are very rare, but 5 or 6 landers, if you have 17 lands, is again 10%. So 20% of your hands will have 0, 1, 5, or 6 lands. That's quite a lot. That's, 1 in 5 of your hands will be like that. And, in some decks, these will be very unplayable. Okay, so how does it look like in... so to zoom in, the main differences between different amount of lands in the paper Magic and in best of 3 is the switch between the number of 2-landers and 4-landers. So basically, if you want to cast things that are way over 4 mana, you want to make sure that you will have enough 4-landers, so you want to probably play 17, 18 lands. If your mana curve stops very early, you can actually allow yourself to play 16 lands, maybe even 15 in some extreme cases, because you will still get like a decent amount, like, 70, 80% of your hands will be in the range when you will have 2 lands or more. And since you don't care about getting to 4 that much, you might get away with it, but it requires a very special deck to do that. Okay, so how does it look with smoothing? And hopefully you can see the difference between these two graphs and you can listen to the difference. Basically, what it changes is independently whether you have 15 or 18 lands or anything in between, roughly 98, 99% of your hands will contain 2, 3, or 4 lands. So you basically have almost nothing in terms of 5, 6, 7 lands hands. And only when you have 15 lands, you go up to 2% of the one-landers, but you almost get none of them in 16, 17, or 18 land decks. What is also interesting, you get quite a lot of the 3-land hands. These will be way more dominant than they were in the paper magic or in best of 3. So you get almost twice as many of the 3-land hands in best of 1 than you would have in best of 3. So you can almost bank on having 3 lands in your opening hand. And this changes quite a lot. What you can also see is that changing the number of lands doesn't change how many 3-land hands you get that much. You will see a small drop in 15-land decks, but it's between 54 and 56% for 16, 17, and 18 lands, respectively. But the changes that you get in number of 2-landers and 4-landers between when you change the number of lands are much bigger. So when they were only 3 percentage points in paper magic, here your changes will be 8 to 9 percentage points, even 10, by changing only 1 land in terms of how you get. So for example, a 15-land deck will have 42% of the hands with 2 lands and only 8% of the hands with 4 lands. And an 18-land deck will have only 15% of 2-landers and as much as 30% of 4-landers. So that's a big shift, and that means that there are ramifications of that in your deck construction that you really want to be low to the ground when you put 15 lands, because even though you will get those 2-3 lands, you will very rarely get more than that. So you don't want to have top end in that kind of deck. But you will get 90% of your hands will get 2 or 3 lands in a 15-land deck. So this is something that you can use. If you know that your curve stops at 3, you can play 15 lands, no problem. You will still 9 out of 10 times get your lands easily. Actually, 8% of the 4 landers, 98% of the time you will get to 2, 3 lands. So this is the comparison on the same kind of scale, and you can see maybe better how the differences look like. You can see clearly from those graphs, and I will put this time the presentation in the show notes of the podcast. So for those listening, you can actually look at the show notes and open the PDF of the presentation and look at the data if you feel a bit lost. So you can get the full benefit of actually watching the data and not having to gape at my face. But you can see those steeper differences between 2-landers and 4-landers in the smoothing. And you can see the almost disappearance of any 0, 1, 5, 6, or 7-land hands. Well, 7 hands lands were not there anymore, but this is a big drop. Like, you compare that 18-land deck in best of 3 will have 11% of the hands with 5 lands and 1% with of 5-landers in best of 1. So you almost eliminate this type of hand. Okay, J2S Josh is crying that he's always hitting. Are you sure that it's not Florida man that stole your account? And you can see the same also with 1-landers, when basically if you play 15 lands in best of 3, 14% of your hands will be 1-landers. and that drops to only 2% in best of one, which means that you can gamble on those 15 lands a bit more, because you know that, yes, you might get stuck on 2 lands for a long time, but if your deck is operational on those 2 lines, that shouldn't be it shouldn't be a problem. But you're all but guaranteed to get to those 2 lands that you need to operate on. While in best of 3, you have this 17% of getting 0 or 1 lands, which will make it completely useless for you to play. So that's the big difference. Okay, so after looking at this, I decided to calculate some mana scenarios that I thought would be useful to know for you. And basically, all those scenarios have same kind of construction. And they show on how mana accessibility will differ between best of 1 and best of 3. And by scenarios, I mean how many % of the games will give me enough lands to play land X by turn Y. And all of the scenarios are on the play, so you don't draw on your first turn. And I decided to look at them without mulligans. Now, obviously, in the real life, if you have a 0 lander, you will mulligan it, but I just didn't want to make those assumptions, so I just calculated all the scenarios and just assumed that even though that in some cases in best of 3 you will take just many more mulligans than you would do in best of 1. So and after a mulligan you still don't have a guarantee of drawing the right mana. So basically the main 2 that I thought are interesting because they pertain to 2 main types of decks are chance of playing 3 lands by turn 3 on the play. And here, the smoothing gives you a higher chance of playing this 3rd land by turn 3 in every single scenario that I looked at. So 15, 16, 17, or 18 lands. So of note, at 15 land, you have 84% chance of hitting 3 lands by turn 3 when you're playing smoothing, and only 75 when you play Paper Magic or best of 3. And this difference of roughly 8% stays across the board. So 16 lands, you get 89% versus 80. 17 lands, you get 93. That's the important number. If you play 17 lands, you have 93% chance of hitting 3 lands by turn 3 when you're on the play. In Paper, it's only 85%. And probably a large chunk of that difference will be mulligan, basically. And when you're playing 18 lands, you are 96% to get 3 lands by turn 3, and only 88% when you do it in Paper and best of 3. So that's a big difference. It means that you're guaranteed to get to your 3rd land, and this is probably why aggro is so promoted. That's exactly that difference is responsible for aggro being slightly promoted. Because you will always curve out nicely, because you will always get those lands. I mean, it will be very rare for you not to get a nice land curve out, and that could be considered unlucky. The second scenario, and that's the flip side of that coin, is the chance. Whoa, I'm sorry for the viewers, but it should say 6 lands by turn 6. I didn't change it for no reason, but basically this is the chance of playing 6 lands by turn 6. And here it basically starts off that Paper has a massive advantage of playing 6 lands by turn 6. Well, massive, 5 percentage points. So basically you get 19% chance of playing 6 lands by turn 6 when you play 15 lands, and 24 when you play that in Paper, which is probably not great, because in Paper, if you put 15 lands, you probably don't want to play 6 of them, and still quarter of the time you will be able to do that. While in the smoothing, even though you're more likely to hit the 3rd land, you're much less likely to hit the 6th land. So you have this natural flood insurance, and that's related to the fact that you don't draw those 5-6 land hands in best of 1. So basically this is a disadvantage of Paper. You will get flooded more frequently if you don't want to. But when you go to 18 lands, the difference disappears, and They both have around 46-47% chance of hitting the sixth land on turn 6 when you are on the play. So even though you are less likely to hit the sixth land on low lands, in high lands this difference gets quickly equilibrated by drawing the extra card and getting better odds of drawing lands, even though you didn't draw those 5-6 landers in the beginning. So at 70 lands, you still get only 39%, 36% chance of hitting 6 lands by turn 6, which is slightly lower than 39% from the paper magic. So this is another thing that gives a slight advantage to the aggro, since aggro is not interested in hitting that land, 6th land by turn 6, that as much as a control deck would be most likely. Aggro can easily deal with that, not playing that 6th land, or at least should be easily capable of doing that. While controls will have problem, because even if you put those 18 lands, you still have like minimal disadvantage on how frequently you will play those 6 lands. So probably at 19 lands, you will actually have a higher chance of hitting that 6 land in smoothing, but then you have to play 19 lands, which is of course a risky strategy even for a control deck. So basically, the two sides of the same coin. Smoothing provides better curve out scenarios for the aggressive decks by making them hit the third land more reliably, and control decks that especially top and heavy control decks, or things that are, you know, hoping to drop a bomb with 7 mana cost, will have a problem because the algorithm trims off those mana rich hands as well, which means that you will more rarely will have a good curve out till the 6th land, basically. Okay, so again, how does the smoothing algorithm operate? Basically, this is the main question. So the main differences that we see from the theoretical distribution of the lands in hand and the practical data from hand smoothing is that you lose all those 0, 1, 5, and 6 land hands. So these are probably eliminated actively by the algorithm, which means that if you draw 3 hands, you really need like 3 0 landers in those 3 for that to happen. In 500,000 games, I found. Okay, chat. Do you want to guess how many 0 landers I found in 500,000 games? Any guesses? It would be good to have one at least. So 500,000 games, and how many of them were 0 landers? So, you know, every time I see someone complaining that people got Life Puzzler was pretty close, but it was in fact, so I had the guesses of 55, 20,000, 500, 2,000, 33, and 0. It was in fact 4. There was 4 zero landers in 500,000 games. 3 of them were in 17 lands bracket, but there was many more games, and one of them was in 14 land deck, which, you know, may be expected if you play 14 lands. So yeah, it's not something that will happen very often. So every time someone tells me like, oh, I always draw 0 lands in best of 1, I'm very skeptical that someone can be that unlucky. So yeah, the hands that are 0, 1, 5, and 6 are eliminated. But, you know, you have to keep in mind, these are usually around 20% of hands in best of 3. So if you eliminate 20% of the hands, you have to put them somewhere. And mostly, this is put into the bracket of Freelanders. So analysis paralysis. I will address the Shuffler is rigged today. It's not. Thank you very much. But I will actually show you some data on the shuffler. I didn't go too deep on the shuffler, but I do know that some people are very adamant that shuffler is rigged, but they're also very misinformed about how shuffler operates, and yeah, they are misinformed by their own dreams and hopes, I guess, which is not an uncommon situation in humanity right now. But okay. I will come to that in a second because there is a specific slide that deals with that particular topic. Okay, so if you can look at the graph, that's exactly what happens. You see around 20% more of the 3-land hands than in the theoretical paper distribution. And the other thing that is different is this steeper differences between how many 2-landers and 4-landers will you get. And I think that these are the main things to keep in mind when you are actually trying to design your decks based on the best of one. First of all, you know that you're going to get a lot more chances of playing your 3-drops, which in theory should make you utilize the 3-drops or combinations of a 2-drop and a one mana trick much more efficiently, because you almost are guaranteed to be able to do that. Second of all, if you play with a number of lands, you have to know what it means. If you put 18 lands, you should know that around 85% of the time you will get three or four lands in your opening hand. So you will be on the good track to get to five drops, for example. If you put 15 lands, you should know that 90% of the time you will start with 2-3 lands. So the question from Lord of Ironforge is, why is 3 lands higher with 17 lands rather than with 18? Well, because there is much more of the 4-land hands. That's the main answer, basically. Because it's not going to be that the more lands you put, the more of the 3-land hands you will get. It will be that at some stage you start dropping off. So basically, I will show you that on the graph because, it's hard to explain in paper. But basically, this graph, if you start with, if I would add like 14, 13, 12, and then 19, 20, 21 land decks, this graph would probably look something like this. And then it will basically peak on 17 lands. This is the optimum of getting 3 lands. And then it will slowly start dropping off, while this part, the 4-land hands, will continue increasing until they reach the optimum and they start dropping off. And then the 5-land hands will start increasing, and so on and so forth. So that's how it will all work with the increasing number of lands. And obviously, you get 40 lands, you will have 100% of the 7-landers. Yeah, that's your maximum. No, Lord of Ironforge. This is exactly 3, exactly 4, exactly 5, exactly 6, exactly 7. Yeah. So yeah. That's going to be the property of it, and I think that it's the same property, but albeit much more flat with the theoretical distribution. Although I would have to calculate it, but I assume it is so. I mean, if over a certain amount of lands, the optimum will move from 3 lands to 4 lands, and if you drop below a certain level, the optimum will like with 15 lands in best of 3, you almost reach the that you have more 2-landers than 3-landers. So I assume that if in 14-land deck you will have more 2-land hands than 3-land hands, and this will become the dominant number. So this is why 17 lands, by the way, great tool again, remind you. But 17 lands is the optimal number of lands in the deck, because this is the optimum for the 3-land hands. The most 3-land hands that you will get is when you play 17 lands, and that's what you want to get for, best chance of having a game of Magic where you can play your things. So what we know is that you trim those 0, 1, 5, 6, 7 land hands. you boost the 3-land hands, and you have a huge gradients of the 2-landers and 4-landers, depend on how many lands you put. Now, from this, we can actually mathematically prove that it has to be 3 hands that the shuffler takes into account. And it's basically these numbers, the 14% of the 1-land hands in the theoretical best of 3 turns into 2%. If you would only have 2 hands, it would happen more frequently. And then the shuffler would have to generate some kind of a weird scenario when it draws 2 hands and then decides to discard them and draw a third one, because there will be too many of those 1%ers, 1-land hands. And it's the same with 0-land hands. They would happen more frequently than we observe in the actual data, which means that it must select from 3 hands. And we can show it from the data that wizards were actually saying the truth when they told us that they take 3 hands into account. For instance, this 2% of the 6-land hands, when you have 18 lands, turns into almost nothing, actual nothing when you have smoothing, and that would be slightly higher than nothing based on the sample sizes as well. So if I would calculate. So we can show mathematically that they do indeed have 3 hands to select. But we don't know exactly what the order is, and I think that the mechanism is that it gives you the most probable number of lands in your hand based on your land distribution. So for example, if you have 17 lands, the most likely number of lands that you would have in your hand is 3. So if you have in your 3 hands at least 1 3-lander, you will get it. So it will mean that quite a lot of time you will get a 3-lander. That's why you get this 56%. But if that was strictly the case, this number would not be 56%. I calculated that. It would be something more like 67%. Which means that the algorithm must have certain rules for exceptions. So because if you would take 3 hands and always select the one with the most likely distribution, you would not get this thing that I showed you at the beginning. You would not get the equal number of average lands in opening hand as you have in best of 3. You will have a slightly higher number in the smoothing, which means that smoothing must have some kind of a countermeasure for that sometimes selects a weaker hand with fewer lands to bring the average to the average that you would expect from best of 3 values. So I think that how it operates is basically it selects the most likely hand, and then it checks with the last, 100,000 games on Arena, and check if the average lands per hand are higher than the average should be or lower than the average should be. If it's higher than the average should be, it selects a hand with lower lands instead, and if it's lower, then it selects the hand with higher. But this is only speculation, because I cannot literally, without knowing the algorithm, tell you that. It probably doesn't matter into nitty-gritty how exactly it works. It probably is something like that, because otherwise it wouldn't work. Okay. That concludes the part on how the smoother operates. Now there's one more thing that people have been speculating quite a lot, and that's the shuffler. And I can't address all the shuffler conspiracies, although maybe I will make an episode on the shuffler conspiracy. So by the way, if you have some good shufflers conspiracies that I could test, please do send me them on Twitter, tag me or whatever, or PM me on Discord, and I could maybe make a whole episode on debunking the shuffler conspiracies, which will of course make me a shill for the big shuffler or something. But there's one particular shuffler speculation that I've seen several times, and that is you are more likely to get mana screw with best of 1 because it gives you more likely two mountains or two swamps in your deck rather than the mixture swamp mountain. So I tested it, obviously. Okay. So this is the data of drawing only one color lands if you have a deck with 17 lands with a 9 to 8 basic land split. That was just the easiest thing to calculate. But basically, here we have the theoretical value, and here we have the real data. So if I have 17 lands in my deck, they're split 9 to 8. In theory, I'll have around 47% chance of being color screwed when I draw 2 lands in my opening hand. Then I looked at all the hands that have 2 lands and this exactly 17 lands, 9 to 8 split, and it's 46.3%. It's really close to what you would expect. There's a slight variance, but that's what you see. Blink twice. Wouldn't it be more fair to calculate what bias the pick most likely hand rule would have, then take a random number to either keep the most likely hand or the corrective higher or lower hand? I did calculate. I might show you after in the question times, because in a previous presentation I did calculate exactly what bias would the pick most likely hand would have. I just didn't put it in this one because I thought it would be too nitty gritty to discuss in something that might be in the format of the podcast. But coming back to this one, you have 47% chance of being color screwed if you draw 2 lands with this in this scenario, and we observe 46.3. If you draw 3 lands, you have 20.6% chance of getting only 3 lands of one color, and we observe 20.7%. And if you draw 4 lands, you are expected to be color screwed 8.2%, and you see it 8.4%. So from this data, I don't see any kind of evidence on seeing the color screws happening more frequently or less frequently than they would be expected. It's exactly as it should be, which means the shuffler, at least in this aspect, doesn't cheat, which makes me think it doesn't cheat, because it would be very elaborate if it was against maybe some particular user is just like on the blacklist of WotC and they want to punish him for whatever. But from the data, I can see that there is no bias. What I think happens is that people underestimate how frequently those things will happen. So if we look at the 17 lands, quarter of your hands roughly will be 2 landers in smoothing, and then half of those will be color screw roughly. So 1 in 8 hands with in 17 land decks roughly will be a 2 land color screw, and this is more frequent than I think people expect it to happen. Then 1/5 of the 3 landers, so we got almost 56%. We got 56% of 3 land hands, and then 20% of those. So that's another 10% of hands in total. 1 in 10 will be color screwed with 3 lands. So 1 in 10, 1 in 8. So that makes it hard to calculate for me. 12.5. 22. So that's 22% of the hands will have color screw, basically. And then plus some percentage of the weird hands where you get color screwed on 4, which will be particularly painful, and people think, oh, that can never happen. Well, it does happen in 8% of the 20% of the hands. So that's 1.6%, 1.7. In one game in 50, you will get 4 lands of the same color in your opening hand and be color screwed on that, with 17 lands and 9 to 8 basic split. Okay, so that concludes the Shuffler Conspiracy section of this presentation. There is no such thing, and during the question time, I will maybe go back to the old presentation when I have a couple of extra slides that might be interesting for the questions that I've seen. But till then, yes, I would like to thank 17 Lands team, Viral Misnomer, Hululu, Grant Wu, all the guys that are making 17 Lands awesome. And I would like to thank Fake Jake Brown, who did help me with starting it in the podcast form. And hopefully, in a couple of days, this one will also be available as a podcast and with the presentation in the show notes. So yeah, thanks for listening to that, and I will be taking the questions now.